Hello, my name is Peter Hounsell. The year 2020 is the 300th anniversary of the birth of the naturalist Gilbert White. And in this celebration today, I want to talk about White as a naturalist and say something of his links with the London Borough of Ealing. So Gilbert White, The Natural History of Selborne and Perivale Wood, a tercentenary celebration. Travelling on an eastbound Central Line train between Greenford and Perivale, you will see from the carriage windows Perivale Wood on the left-hand side, that's the north side. You may know that Perivale Wood is a stretch of ancient woodland owned and managed by the Selborne Society. You may well be a member, or if not, have visited the nature reserve on one of its open days and marvelled at the display of native bluebells beneath the trees. On the right-hand side of the train, you will glimpse Selborne School. Both the school and the nature reserve are named after the village of Selborne. Selborne is in Hampshire, south of Alton, and close to Chawton, where Jane Austen lived from 1809 to 1827. What connects this Hampshire village to Perivale Wood and Selborne School is Gilbert White, who was born 300 years ago this year and who spent nearly all of his life in the village. In this talk, I want to celebrate his life, say something of why he's such a highly regarded and well-loved naturalist, and explain the connection between Selborne and the London Borough of Ealing. White, for much of his adult life, was a Church of England clergyman and served as curate at Selborne and elsewhere. In Selborne, the vicar was an absentee, so White is likely to have carried out most of the clerical and pastoral duties in the parish. But he knew Selborne from his childhood. He'd been born there, and his grandfather was vicar there until his death in 1728. Gilbert's father had not followed his own father into the church, but had trained for the law. He did not practice as a lawyer for very long, since he was wealthy enough to retire from the bar and pursue the life of a country gentleman. He lived in a house known as the Wakes, now the Gilbert White Museum. Gilbert was one of his 11 children. Gilbert went to school first in Farnham and then to the grammar school in Basingstoke. As was usual at the time, his education was grounded in the Greek and Latin classics, but he also enjoyed poetry in English and started writing his own. Some of the poetry he read was newly written. He owned a copy of James Thomson's long poem, The Seasons, for example, published in 4 volumes, one for each season, between 1726 and 1730. The poem would be set to music by Joseph Haydn 60 years later. Gilbert's pursuits as a schoolboy were not all bookish. He enjoyed time spent outdoors, whether exploring the countryside or hunting. He became a good shot with a gun. University was the natural next step, and he went up to Oriel College, Oxford, in 1740. Here he spent his time like many undergraduates of the period. It is known that he attended concerts and coffee houses, played cards and chess, and drank wine, cider, and many different varieties of tea. He also visited a number of country houses and their gardens, including Burley, Stowe, and Wilton. He read contemporary English writers who for us are classic authors, but were new in White's day, including Henry Fielding, Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and Samuel Richardson. He continued to hunt, out with his gun to shoot birds, accompanied by his dog, Fairy. He was later to reject the gratuitous killing of animals, but still continued to shoot game for the table and to provide specimens to study. In 1743, he graduated Bachelor of Arts. Alexander Pope was a guest at his graduation ceremony, and he presented White with a copy of his translation of Homer's Iliad. This 6-volume set is now in the British Library. It contains the inscription, quote, "Given to me by Mr. Alexander Pope on my taking the degree of Bachelor of Arts, June the 30th, 1743. It also contains 2 sketches of White, which are the only known authentic likenesses of him. And here's one of them. In 1744, White was elected as a fellow of his college and was destined for either a conventional clerical career or an academic one as a fellow of Oriel College. The path he would choose was not clear for a few years, but he was ordained priest in 1749. As he was unable to become vicar of Selborne, because the patronage of the parish belonged to the Magdalen College, he took up a curacy at the nearby village of Harringdon in 1751. In later years, he declined several better livings and remained curate variously of Farringdon, Selborne, and other villages in the area. However, he served as the Oxford University's junior proctor from 1752 to 1753, and from 1752 he was dean of Oriel College. His academic career finally ended in 1757 after he stood unsuccessfully for the provostship of his college. With the death of his father in 1758, he inherited the family home, the Wakes, in the centre of Selborne, and here he lived for the rest of his life. He never married, but eventually Mrs. John White, the widow of one of his brothers, came to live at the Wakes and kept house for him. The Wakes became a family home to which he welcomed an increasing number of nephews and nieces, totaling as many as 62 if you include their spouses. The inevitable result, I suppose, of having 10 siblings. Comfortably settled back home, White undertook the usual range of parish duties, but this left him time to spend visiting friends and relatives in many parts of southern England and the West Midlands and working on his garden. A keen gardener from his youth, in 1751, Gilbert started to keep what he termed a garden calendar. That is a daily record of his activities in the garden and the natural world around him. He would maintain this kind of record for more than 40 years. He already owned one of the standard gardening books of the period. Paul Miller, the curator of the Physic Garden in Chelsea, had first published his garden dictionary in 1731. This was a guide to, quote, cultivating and improving the kitchen, fruit and flower garden. And this is exactly what White started to do at the Wakes. The calendar records what he did in the garden, the weather, the results of seed trials, and the growth and development of the fruit and vegetables he grew. He also undertook extensive landscaping works in the garden during the 1750s and 60s and extended the grounds by purchasing a neighbouring orchard. He constructed a fruit wall to grow fruit trees against and paved walks. He created a grass terrace and a zigzag path leading towards the wooded slope, the hanger, where he erected a statue of Hercules. The garden was separated from the meadow behind by a ha-ha, a sunken barrier designed to keep cattle and sheep out of the garden without any visible obstacle. There was an extensive herb garden near the house. Another fashionable garden attribute of the period was a hermitage, which is essentially a mock hermit cell roofed with thatch. We'll see this in a later slide. Whilst much of White's garden still survives or has been recreated, the hermitage has been lost. He also erected a roofed port wine seat, so named as it was made from half a port barrel. This was fitted with a revolving base, so it could be turned around and allowed White to sit and observe the wildlife in the meadow and wood beyond, as in a birdwatcher's hide. His interest began to extend beyond his gardening to a wider study of the natural world around him. So the calendar began to include references to natural phenomena. For example, he records, quote, saw a very unusual sight, a large flock of house martins playing about between the fields and the hanger, unquote. To support these studies, he expanded his library, purchasing books on natural history such as Hudson's Flora Anglica, published in 1762. 1767 was to be a pivotal year in White's involvement with natural history. He made his annual visit to two of his brothers who lived in London, one of whom was a merchant, the other a leading bookseller specializing in books on natural history. As such, his shop was a meeting point for many people with an interest in the subject. So it's not surprising that during this trip, he made the acquaintance of Joseph Banks, the 24-year-old naturalist, freshly returned from a trip to Newfoundland and Labrador that had made his name, and about to join Captain Cook's expedition to the South Pacific on the Endeavour. More directly important for White's later activities as a naturalist, he also met Thomas Pennant, who just completed a major work on British zoology and been elected to the Royal Society that year. Pennant was based in Wales, and talking to White, he got the impression that in White, he might have found a useful informant and reliable observer of the natural phenomena in his part of southern England. Pennant invited White to correspond with him, and White took up the opportunity and started to send Pennant some of his observations. The first letter was dated 4th of August, 1767, and was about the behavior of swifts, swallows, martins, and other birds. White felt he was well placed to observe birds, as he noted at the end of the letter, quote, the parish I live in is a very abrupt, uneven country, full of hills and woods, and therefore full of birds, end of quote. It was about this time that an annual notebook for naturalists called the Naturalist Journal, devised by Daines Barrington, was first published by Gilbert's brother Benjamin. Barrington was a few years younger than White and was a judge, naturalist, antiquary, and fellow of both the Royal Society and the Society of Antiquaries. Barrington had established a system for, quote, keeping a daily register of observations on the weather, plants, birds, insects, etc., end of quote. And his journal consisted of a printed sheet for each week, with a series of columns with different headings such as temperature, air pressure, wind direction, rainfall, trees first in leaf, plants first in flower. These tabular pages were used by Gilbert from around 1769 to assist with his study of the natural history around his village. A typical weekly page could include as many as 100 entries. On this page from 1769, he reported in the column for miscellaneous observations, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, quote, saw the planet Venus enter the disk of the sun. Just as the sun was setting, the spot was very visible to the naked eye. Nightingale sings, wood owl hoots, fern owl chatters, end of quote. White's observations began to spill out of the confines of these printed sheets, and he started to add blank sheets into his copy to allow him to include more extended observations. These are mostly about natural history, but from time to time events in the wider world intrude. On the 21st of January 1793, towards the end of White's life, he notes between his observations about turnip greens and the snowdrops coming into bloom, the beheading of the French King Louis XVI, and added that the king's body was, quote, flung into a deep grave without any coffin or funeral service performed, end of quote. The journal also records the comings and goings of his visitors and the births, deaths, and marriages within his large extended family. White began to correspond with Barrington as well as with Pennant. His first letter to Barrington is dated the 30th of June, 1769, and begins, quote, when I was in town last month, I partly engaged that I sometime do myself the honour to write to you on the subject of natural history. And I am the more ready to fulfil my promise, because I see you are a gentleman of great candour, and one that will make allowances. especially where the writer professes to be an outdoor naturalist, one that takes his observations from the subject itself and not from the writings of others." End of quote. This gives a very good idea of why White was such an important figure for the study of natural history, because he was grounded in the use of empirical data. Paul Foster, who's written extensively on White's life and writings, discerns a difference between the letters addressed to Pennant and those to Barrington. Those to the former are largely descriptive, while those to Barrington are more, quote, relaxed and speculative. White benefited from his correspondence with both men. He also encouraged his brother John, who was stationed in Gibraltar, to take an interest in natural history and to send him specimens, some of which were later presented to the Royal Society. This first letter to Barrington contains a list of summer birds of passage which he had observed in the Selborne neighbourhood. Having read White's observations about migratory birds, Barrington persuaded him to write a more extended work about the birds he so closely watched. So Gilbert wrote monographs for the Royal Society on swallows, swifts, and martins. White began to contemplate publication of his observations, and in 1776 he commissioned the artist Samuel Hieronymus Grimm to create the illustrations for the projected work. Grimm painted 12 watercolours of Selborne in a matter of 24 days. In keeping with the kind of books published at this time, White felt it necessary to add to his observations of the natural world a description of the antiquities of Selborne, that is, a kind of local history of the place. So when the book was published by his book-selling brother in November 1788, although the title page says 1789, its title was "The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne in the County of Southampton, with engravings and an appendix." As you can see, there is a picture of the hermit's cell on the title page. The natural history purports to comprise 3 sets of letters, the first to Pennant, the second to Barrington, and a third set, unaddressed, forming an account of the antiquities. There was a reason for republishing the letters rather than writing a new work. You will remember that among White's reading as a young man were novels by Samuel Richardson. Richardson's Pamela is what is known as an epistolatory novel, that is, written as a series of letters. This gives a sense of immediacy to the narrative. Having at hand copies of the letters he'd written to Barrington and Pennant, these form the basis of White's new book and provide a freshness to the writing. It is as if White had been out in the fields at the back of the house and come in to set down his discoveries in a letter to one of his correspondents. However, things are not quite as they seem, as there is an element of artifice involved here. In reality, this is a more consciously literary work. Some of the letters have been reworked, and the first 9 letters to Pennant are undated and are not actually letters that White sent him. They are designed to give background information about Selborne. So the first letter starts like this. The parish of Selborne lies at the extreme eastern corner of the county of Hampshire, bordering on the county of Sussex, and not far from the county of Surrey. It is about 50 miles southwest of London, in latitude 51, and near midway between the towns of Alton and Petersfield. At the foot of this hill, 1 stage or step from the uplands, lies the village, which consists of one single straggling street, 3/4 of a mile in length, in a sheltered vale and running parallel with the Hanger. So it's letter number 10 that is the first letter that White had sent to Pennant at the beginning of their correspondence, as we heard, dated August the 4th, 1767. His observations on flora and fauna are very precise. Here is an example from a letter to Pennant in February 1769 about hedgehogs. Hedgehogs abound in my garden and fields. The manner in which they eat the roots of the plantain in my grass walks is very curious. With their upper mandible, which is much longer than their lower, they bore under the plant and so eat the roof off upwards, leaving the tuft of leaves untouched. In this respect, they are serviceable, as they destroy a very troublesome weed, but they deface the walks in some measure by digging little round holes. It appears by the dung that they drop upon the turf that beetles are no inconsiderable part of their food. Now, this is a fascinating observation in its own right, but some of his observations of birds played a part in one of the major debates that were engaging the scientific community at this time, the one about whether birds hibernated in the winter or whether they migrated. In this debate, the two naturalists with whom he corresponded were on opposite sides of the argument, with Daines Barrington doubting that long-distance migration took place. White's observations in Hampshire and letters from his brother in Gibraltar provided strong evidence that many species did indeed migrate. In that first letter to Barrington, he listed for a large number of birds the date in the spring when he first observed them. For example, swallow, April the 13th, nightingale, beginning of April. He also noted a number of birds which he observed all year round, such as robins, sparrows, wrens, and wagtails, and also a list of winter birds of passage, such as the fieldfare and the redwing, that he first noticed in the autumn. His letter to Barrington on the 12th of February 1771 began like this: "You are, I know, no great friend to migration, and the well-attested accounts from various parts of the kingdom seem to justify you in your suspicions that at least many of the swallow kind do not leave us in the winter, but lay themselves up like insects and bats in a torpid state, and slumber away the more uncomfortable months till the return of the sun and fine weather awakens them." But after this somewhat deferential opening, White goes on, but then we must not, I think, deny migration in general, because migration certainly does subsist in some places, as my brother in Andalusia has fully informed me. Of the motions of these birds, he has ocular demonstration for many weeks together, both spring and fall, during which myriads of the swallow kind traverse the straits, that's the Straits of Gibraltar, from north to south and from south to north, according to the season. Although much of White's engagement with the world around him was by observation, he was quite happy to test his and other people's theories by dissection. In a letter to Barrington in 1776, he discusses an assertion made by a French anatomist that the curious behavior of cuckoos in placing their eggs in other birds' nests arose from the internal structure of their parts, which incapacitates them from incubation. To test this theory, he procured a cuckoo and dissected it. He concluded on the basis of the bird's anatomy that the suggestion might have some justification, but he wondered if other birds were different anatomically, which led him to make further dissections of birds known to incubate their young. He chose what he described as a fern owl, one of the country names for the nightjar. He felt able, on the basis of the similarity of the anatomy of the fern owl and the cuckoo, to dispute the hypothesis. And he wrote, "Now, as it appears that this bird, which is well known to practice incubation, is formed in a similar manner with cuckoos, Monsieur Hérisson's conjecture the cuckoos are incapable of incubation from the disposition of their intestines seems to fall to the ground, and we are still at a loss for the cause of that strange and singular peculiarity in the instance of the Cuculus canorus." Most of the letters are written about the flora and fauna of the Hampshire countryside, but occasionally White describes more exotic animals. In the Natural History of Selborne, the correspondence is only one way. So White's letters to Pennant and Barrington, so we see White's letters to Pennant and Barrington, but not theirs to him. So clearly when White writes to Pennant in March 1770 about a moose, he is responding to something that Pennant had written, as he is describing events that took place a year and a half previously. He writes about a visit he made to Goodwood. "On Michaelmas Day, 1768, I managed to get a sight of the female moose belonging to the Duke of Richmond at Goodwood, but was greatly disappointed when arriving at the spot, to find that it died, after having been in a languishing state for some time, on the morning before. However, understanding that it was not stripped, I proceeded to examine this rare quadruped. I found it in an old greenhouse, slung under the belly and chin by ropes and in a standing posture. But though it had been dead for so short a time, it was in so putrid a state that the stench was hardly supportable. This, however, did not prevent White from examining it and measuring it, producing a detailed description. He ends the letter, "Please let me know if my female moose corresponds with what you saw, and whether you think still that the American moose and the European elk are the same creature." It apparently seems they are. The publication of the Natural History was well received, although one of the earlier reviews in the Gentleman's Magazine, anonymously, was actually by Gilbert's brother, Thomas. At the same time, he received a letter from an army officer and ornithologist, George Montague, who said that reading the Natural History had encouraged him in his own observations. He wrote, "Your work produced in me a fresh ardour, and with that degree of enthusiasm necessary to such investigation, I pervaded the interior recesses of the thickest woods and spread my researches to every place within my reach." The book quickly gained readers and has been widely read since the time of its publication. One edition or another has been in print ever since. Some of its readers were distinguished in their own right. For example, the two poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge both had read the Natural History, Wordsworth in his school days, as had the young Charles Darwin. Darwin wrote, quote, "From reading White and Selborne, I took much pleasure in watching the habits of birds and even made notes on this subject. In my simplicity, I remember wondering why every gentleman did not become an ornithologist." The book would quickly go through many editions, first as reprints of the original quarto volumes, but then in more accessible and cheaper editions. For many of these new ones, the antiquities, which were deemed less interesting and original than the Natural History, were dropped and are rarely included in modern editions. These new editions were designed to reach a wider public and were known to have been read by many of the leading literary figures of the 19th century, such as Thomas Carlyle, George Eliot, Charles Kingsley, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry David Thoreau among them. John Ruskin made a typically pompous observation about the book. "The only piece of natural history in the English language that I know of is in the few lines of Milton on the creation. The only example of a proper manner of contribution to natural history is in White's letters from Selborne." White had only a few years to enjoy the success of his natural history, as he died in 1793. After his death, other writings of his have been published. The Naturalist's Calendar, which he kept for so many years, was published by John White in 1795. His journals and letters have also been published in scholarly editions. The illustrators of White's Natural History are also interesting. As mentioned earlier, White commissioned colour engravings for the first publication, and most subsequent editions have been illustrated. There are two different approaches to illustrating this book. One is to show what the different birds and animals that White discusses look like for the benefit of those who may not know them. So, for example, the edition for children edited by the Reverend J.G. Wood in 1854 includes engravings of nearly every animal mentioned by Mr. White. An edition in 1875 had illustrations by Philip Henry Delamotte, who was also a noted earlier photographer. He both illustrated the animals that White described, but also places in the village and surrounding area which White mentioned, including this picture of White's house as it then was. Another tactic was to take an existing set of botanical illustrations to show what the different species looked like. Thomas Bewick was a Newcastle-based engraver who produced very detailed engravings, particularly of British birds. His History of British Birds was published in 2 volumes in 1797 and 1804. And for those wanting high quality pictures for identification purposes, they were ideal. James Edward Harding's edition, first published in 1875, has selections from Buick. By the 1890s, it was possible to use photographic illustrations, such as in John Burroughs' edition of 1895, which has photographs by Clifton Johnson. He was an American photographer and author with a particular interest in country life, and he'd visited England at the behest of the Appleton Company specifically to prepare the illustrations for the Natural History. Another American edition published in 1898 was the first to include colour photographs. In the 20th century, a number of distinguished British artists were encouraged to illustrate the natural history. Eric Fitt Daglish was an engraver and the illustrator of a large number of books on natural history, including Birds of the British Isles. As well as illustrating the natural history, he also illustrated many other classics of natural history, including Walton's Complete Angler and works by Thoreau and W.H. Hudson. The non-such edition of the writings of Gilbert White of Selborne, issued in 1938 in 2 volumes, was illustrated by the most celebrated engraver of the period, Eric Revilius. It includes the Natural History, the Naturalist Journal, and the Antiquities, poems and correspondence, and was designed to be a prestigious piece of publishing in a limited edition of only 850 copies. Revilius had known the book for many years, as it mirrored his own love of the natural world. From being commissioned to illustrate it, he made a trip to Selborne and stayed there a few days, looking at the village and the surrounding area. The place, he thought, remained much as White had described it. He produced elaborate title pages for the 2 volumes and headpieces for the beginning of each letter. Rather than just illustrating the birds and other animals that White describes, he tried to convey the experience that White had and to see White himself in context. He describes the practice of burning off the heathland in letter 7, and he captures effectively White's writings of a rust-coloured ferruginous light from letter 65 in 1783. Here, White is describing the strange atmospheric conditions caused by the eruption of an Icelandic volcano. The illustrations were much praised, although his illustration of the moose, which you saw earlier, fails to display quite the disgust that White experienced when trying to measure the putrefying animal. Revilius's fellow engraver John Nash also illustrated an edition in 1951, and a limited edition with colour engravings by him was issued in 1972 in New York. Here are 3 of the coloured illustrations. The first is a view of the hangar, and the second an illustration to letter 27 about the nightjar. The third illustrates a story White tells about a toad in a letter about reptiles in general. The originals of these illustrations are now owned by the Gilbert White Museum. The house in which Gilbert White lived is now a museum, and you can walk in the grounds of the house and see the recreated kitchen gardens, and then stroll across the fields behind the house and up to the wooded slope. The house has recreations of White's bedroom and his study, from which he could look out over the garden. Both the house and grounds are well worth a visit. That brings us then to consider the link between Selborne and Perivale. It largely depends on the popularity that the natural history enjoyed throughout the 19th century, and in the growing interest in conservation and the protection of the natural environment in the last quarter of the century. In 1885, George and Teresa Musgrave founded what was originally called the Selborne League. It was a conservation society, as we would now think of it, with aims including the preservation of birds, wildflowers, and forests and places of popular resort. At the time it was formed, there was also a very specific purpose: to, quote, resist the growing trade in plumage, end of quote. That is, to curb the slaughter of wild birds to provide feathers for ladies' hats. As well as the Selborne League, an anti-plumage league was formed in 1885 but both were short-lived. They merged to form the Selborne Society for the Preservation of Birds, Plants, and Pleasant Places in the following year. The formal rules of the Selborne Society, agreed in 1888, set out the following objectives: to preserve from unnecessary destruction such wild birds, animals, and plants as are harmless, beautiful, or rare; to discourage the wearing and use for ornament of birds and their plumage, except where the birds are killed for food or reared for their plumage; to protect places and objects of interest or natural beauty from ill treatment or destruction; to promote the study of natural history. The Selborne Society was a national organisation with a London headquarters, but with no fixed subscription. However, only those who donated 2 and 6 per annum could hold office or even vote at meetings. Very quickly, there were a number of local branches, initially in Hampshire and Surrey. It had a rival organisation. The Society for the Protection of Birds was formed in 1891, and like the Selborne Society, it campaigned against the wanton destruction of birds, especially to provide feathers for ladies' hats. It would receive a royal charter in 1904, and is, of course, now a major organisation, the RSPB. From its early days, the Society started to issue a new magazine to members. At first, in homage to Gilbert White, these were known as letters, but from 1888, it became the monthly Selborne magazine. From 1890, this became Nature Notes, but reverted to its earlier name in 1909. Regrettably, the Selborne Society did not develop as a mass membership organisation. It seemed to lack focus, not sure whether it was a learned society, a campaigning organisation, or a membership body. Its remit was almost too wide. Whilst it had at its core the protection of birds, topics covered in the magazine included plant collecting, the development or destruction of open spaces, and landscape protection, for example, of opposition to quarrying on Cheddar Gorge and resistance to the erection of telephone poles on commons and open spaces. The branch network of the Society was patchy. By 1907, the Society had 1,712 members in more than 15 branches, of which several were in London, including the Brent Valley one, which later became the Ealing branch. However, its overall membership was only about the 10th of that of the RSPB. Membership peaked at around 3,000 just before the First World War, and then declined year on year, so that at the outbreak of the Second World War, it was a mere 433. After the war, the Society had virtually ceased to exist. Interest in establishing what was originally thought of as a nature reserve for birds went back to the last decade of the 19th century. In 1892, the Society had formed a subcommittee to explore ways of protecting what is now Perivale Wood. A decade later, the committee were managing a wildlife reserve on the site with the agreement of a local farmer. This was originally known as the Brent Valley Bird Sanctuary. In 1905, the committee appointed a keeper to maintain the hedges and coppicing and to protect the bird life. For almost half a century from 1904, the Society was associated with one individual, Wilfred Mark Webb, who lived in Hanwell and edited the Society's magazine. His wife was the secretary of the Ealing branch. Webb tried to revive the Society after the Second World War. Middlesex Ealing branch retained the name of the Society in its archives, and Webb focused his energies on Perivale Wood until his death in 1952. Work continued on building up the Ealing branch and relaunching its journal as the Selborne magazine in 1958. That first issue restated the objects of the Society: to perpetuate the memory of Gilbert White, to protect places of interest and natural beauty, to conserve such wild birds, animals, and plants as harmless, beautiful, and rare, and to encourage the study of natural history. Perivale Wood then became the Society's major asset. So the Society exists today as an independent natural history society with a small but active membership and strong links to the local community. It manages Perivale Wood, Britain's first nature reserve. A more formal rental agreement was made with the church commissioners in 1914 who owned the wood, and by 1922 a public appeal enabled the Selborne Society to purchase Bradish Wood together with the paddock, pondfield and Little Elms Meadow. The reserve was extended by the purchase of a further piece of land in 1931. The site became legally protected as a site of special scientific interest in 1957 and a statutory local nature reserve in 1974. The Selborne Society has recently constructed new buildings on the site, and it runs an active education programme. Another recent interest has been exploring the archaeology of the land it owns. Its open day in the spring attracts a large number of people who come to enjoy the prolific flowering of native bluebells under the trees. As well as the practical management of a stretch of ancient woodland, the Society's ownership of the site allows it to be a place where the natural world can be observed up close and over time in a way that Gilbert White, sometimes thought of as the father of British ecology, would surely have approved. Thank you for listening.